like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and to acknowledge in particular their elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are joining us today, and to acknowledge their role in the land sector and in the university sector, and also to say that it's NAIDOC Week, so keep your eye out for events that are on and turn up and show your support. So I'm KATRINA, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a lecturer in Digital Humanities at the ANU. I'm part of the organising team along with KYLIE Message and Rowan Henderson and Craig Middleton, who can't be here today. So thank you to the organising team for their work in doing this. Also thank you to Melinda Heel and Liliana Oyezan, who have done a lot of the admin work in terms of setting up the Eventbrite and sending reminders, reminding us, reminding you. So thank you very much for their work.
And setting up this fancy venue.
Yeah, setting up this fancy venue where we got told that our building was going to be shut for a few months. Yeah, so the structure today is a couple of really short talks. We've got 6 speakers. We're going to do our best to keep it short. Kylie's already noted that she needs 8 minutes rather than 5. So we're hoping to have about 10 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So yeah, our speakers are Professor KYLIE Message, who is head of the Humanities Research Centre, Claire Sheridan, who is the Senior Collections Advisor at the ANU, JILDA Andrews, who is a Research Fellow at ANU and at the National Museum of Australia, so she's our sort of middle person. Our bridge, that's the word. Libby Stewart, who is the Senior Curator of Research and Partnerships at the AMaGA, and KIRSTEN, who is just 3 weeks, is that right, into her new role as the James Fairfax Senior Fellow of Culture and Environment at the AMaGA. So with that, I'll hand over to KYLIE.
Great, thank you so much, KATRINA, and it's so nice again to see so many faces, and we've had such a great response to this series, so hopefully we can increase the numbers of people that we're able to bring in and feed, of course, but also that we can share some of the conversations that we're having with others through our websites and the like, so thank you very much. I'll also start by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting. We're on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and I pay my respects also to the elders past and present, and acknowledge all First Nations people who might be here with us today. I also acknowledge and thank AMaGA for the support that they're giving us to this series, and also to my conversationalists, I guess, KATRINA, Rowan and Craig. Thanks also to Melinda and Liliana for setting up the venue and arranging us and organising us when we're not all that good at it ourselves, so thank you very much. Thank you, of course, also to our speakers, so it's lovely to be able to get to hear you all together today. So in the conversation today, we're going to touch on some key issues facing galleries, museums, archives and libraries, which are, as you know, holders and shapers of our national heritage. We're also going to think about some of the issues for people who work within cultural institutions. And when I talk about cultural institutions, I actually include universities in that category as well. Although we don't get an acronym in the GLAM, or we don't get a letter in the GLAM acronym, I quite like the idea of glamour. So it hasn't caught on anywhere, but you know, I'll keep working on it. But one of the things that I think that we share across our university collections and museum sector are a number of issues that I think are really contemporary in that they are perennially urgent, perennially timely. But there are also issues that have a long history and have a lot of precedents both recently and in the longer past. So we've seen this recently in continuing debate over ICOM's definition of the word museum, which we probably are starting to get a bit tired of, but that's continuing. We saw discussion of this at the recent Museums Australia conference in Perth, and of course Even the mainstream media have recently taken our issues to heart to some extent in a recent Weekend Australia. So in the short hour that we have today, we'll look at some of the institutional and personal histories, politics and cultures of collection and museum work, and we'll think through some futures. But there's a little bit more background to today's conversation, and I'm very honoured to be the resident background provider today. So the idea for the session today arose because it's roughly 20 years since Caroline Turner from the HRC edited a number of key volumes on the future of museums, Museums of the Future, for the Humanities Research Journal. Now this journal is going to be relaunched later this year with a slew of new research papers that will be focused on a similar theme. This special issue has the title Public Humanities of the Future, Museums, Archives, Universities and Beyond. So you'll see I got universities into that title. Anyway, discussions around these issues and revisiting these issues got us thinking. And we modelled today's panel on one section from one of the issues that was called Future Shots. Prominent Australians share their thoughts on museums of the future. In this section, contributors including Betty Churcher, Andrew Sayers, Carol Scott and Margaret Neal projected forward. In rereading the volumes, I was interested to see the similarities that we shared today with the concerns and agendas from the earlier period, particularly regarding the agendas for research partnerships and collaborations between the HRC and our colleagues in the cultural institutions. What, for example, does research look like when undertaken by or between different institutions? And it's significant today that one of our speakers, Dr. JILDA Andrews, holds a joint appointment at the ANU and NMA. In one article in one of the earlier volumes, the then director of the HRC, Professor Ian McCalman, wrote that there was enacted the conscious development of a national research cluster. Institutions such as the NMA, IAXIS, Screen Sound Australia as it was then, the Academies of Science, the Social Sciences and the Humanities, as well as the HRC and the ANU, were, in his words, beginning to work together on the pattern of the National Mall in Washington DC to develop a series of intermeshed research and development initiatives that will generate innovative research with diverse outcomes for all our communities. Now this is something that I care very passionately about today. And it's why the HRC is committed to developing a raft of new programs and partnerships with institutions across Canberra, including this conversation series. There's been lots and lots of other collaborations across our institutions in the forms of exhibitions, conferences, publications and the like, including one book which Kirsten will probably be horrified that I still have, but a book that was very formative for me, which was this volume called National Museums Negotiating Histories, which was part of a really kind of important conference that was held across the CCR and the NMA in the late 90s. I think this book was published in 2001. So this is a very loved book of mine and it's very falling apart too. So anyway, so there's been lots of things that we've done across our places. But back to our background. I would be remiss if I ended today without acknowledging the vital contribution that Caroline Turner has made, both to the GLAM sector but also to the HRC. Now she was unfortunately not able to join us here today, but she has sent me some notes to share and I'm going to read from these. I will paraphrase some sections. But she said, the overall theme of the earlier issues on Museums of the future of museums, and the aligned issue on Indigenous knowledge arose from the motivation to address the significance of Indigenous knowledge and culture for contemporary museums in Australia, as well as the broader theme of history, because many of our fellows at the time had worked on and were working on projects associated with the opening of the new National Museum of Australia, which opened in 2001, as well as other institutions. Another theme was community involvement in museums and telling the stories and lives of ordinary people, with particular emphasis on those excluded from the narratives, including Indigenous people, women, minorities, and in Australia's case, the contribution of immigrants to Australian culture. I listed these, said Caroline, not me, in the editorial in 2001, along with the environment. The latter was the subject of a research conference with the NMA on deserts in 2003, which was held, although this was unplanned, during the disastrous 2003 Canberra bushfires. In the editorial for the 2001 journal, I asked if what we were seeing in Australian museums at the turn of the century might lead to a redefinition of Australian culture and society. That is a question worth thinking about now in the context of the last 20 years. I also noted a new emerging conservatism regarding history in museums overseas, and similar pressures may be exerted here that could lead to a return of less nuanced national narratives which exclude many from the story. The history wars that erupted at the NMA over Indigenous history proved that comment to be sadly rather prophetic. I do believe, however, that Australian museums and museum professionals have worked very effectively over the intervening years towards overcoming the negatives. There was a lot of optimism in the new millennium and in the essays and the journals, but events such as 9/11, the war on terror, refugee crises, wars in Iraq, Syria, now Ukraine, global challenges to democracy, climate change and the pandemic have all had an influence in society and museums in the interim 20 plus years. I'm still convinced, however, that Australian museums and the staff within those museums remain committed to a belief that museums are critical to the future of humanity and to building a better future for humanity. So that's the end of her notes, but the other thing that Caroline said to me when I spoke to her on Monday was that she couldn't wait to hear what other people had to say about their views and their visions for the future of museums. In fact, she was quite impatient about it and kind of moved me along. So with that spirit in mind, I'm quite happy to pass over to our next speaker. Although, did we organise who it was?
Yes.
Claire.
Our art collection, which is managed by Drill Hall Gallery, so everything I say doesn't necessarily apply to them. So I guess I'll start off by saying that while there's overlap with universities and museums and the issues that we face, universities and particularly ANU is not a museum in its traditional form, and we potentially will never have a museum in its traditional form, so the way that we approach our collections is slightly different to the way you would approach them in a museum or gallery. So my goal and the goal of my team that's sitting here today is to basically improve the management of these collections so that we can rebuild them as research and teaching infrastructure, both for ANU but also on a national and international scale. So our primary audience is First Nations communities and researchers and students. So I guess this question about the future of museums and for us the future of university collections is something that we've been thinking about a lot at ANU. ANU's kind of been grappling this question since 2015, which is when this collections program started. And it's also something that we're talking about quite a lot in Cormac as we approach our 30th anniversary, looking back at the original Cinderella report, where have we come from and where do we still need to go and what issues are we all facing that we need to kind of create some shared solutions to. So I guess I kind of want to touch on two main points that we're talking about quite a bit in the Research Initiatives Infrastructure team. The first one that is quite relevant to us is the NPRES report, so the National Infrastructure Roadmap, and the fact that our collections play a huge role within that roadmap and particularly in future planning of that roadmap. So one of my key objectives is to make sure that university collections aren't overlooked within that when that planning starts happening, but also to make sure that universities are kind of front and centre and we're showing the role that we can play in that space. And also in thinking about collections and their potential as collections, but also how we can use collections and their data to then create tools and processes and research infrastructure that benefits students and researchers and First Nations communities. That kind of leads into my second point, and I'm trying to keep this as short as possible, which is that particularly as we may never have a museum, we're certainly looking at this idea of a global collective, which I think has become more prominent with the ongoing COVID pandemic. So trying to find ways that, yes, our collections have a lot of potential and a lot of significance on their own, but how do we start connecting them with other universities? How do we start bridging this gap between universities and museums? How do we create tools and processes and infrastructure that benefits all of the problems that we're having in a way that we start pooling resources and pooling expertise? So it's very brief, but that's kind of what we're focusing on at the moment, and hopefully will continue to progress in coming years.
Hello, I'm just going to jump in, thank you. My name's JILDA Andrews, thanks for the introduction, guys. I am a Uluru woman. I live and work in Canberra here, and it's NAIDOC Week, so for all of the other Indigenous people in the room. And I think I might be only talking to myself. This isn't representative. It's NAIDOC Week. I've got a dash at 9 o'clock to get somewhere else. And I can't do this by myself. The demand for us as resources actually has increased exponentially over the last 20 years. It is within all of our work programs that we're needing to engage in meaningful ways with Indigenous people. The expectation of our audiences reflect that as well. Our future discussions in the community about how we step towards truth-telling, how we work together, how we shape and forge a national identity requires engagement by Indigenous people, and we're not there. We have no representation other than being in this room. So that means two things. One thing is we need to increase the number of people, Indigenous people who are celebrating NAIDOC Week alongside me in a room like this, and two, that actually the work is yours as well. So let's think about what that work looks like. Let's be creative about how that work looks like, because I think if we get that right, we are embodying and enacting truth-telling in a way that makes us all accountable and in dialogue with the actual truths that need to be told, right? I wasn't actually going to talk about black stuff today, but I can't overlook it, because then we have moments like our national conferences where to have representation is really difficult. A national council needs better representation. It needs different kinds of engagement, and we really need to be creative about that. And we need energy for that as well, because it shouldn't be this really tough thing that we all just are bogged down by or just only see the challenges. To think of 20 years in the future, we actually have to assume that we've got reconciliation right, and then think about the work that needs to happen from that point, where we're in a different dynamic with each other. And that work is so fucking exciting and liberating, and there's a presumed equality there that is really, where else do you get a scenario like that of a presumed equality? What does that work look like? We need vision, we need energy, and we need leadership. We also need a better way of relating to our distributed collections, especially our ethnographic collections, because we're really at risk of losing our connections to what that body of material looks like, what it represents, and how we care for it. Also, how it's then made active in the way that we make and remake our identities going forward. So a networked sense of collection, not this is our collection, this is the NHC, this is the Macleay collection. They're all connected, and they're connected by the people that form them, and they're connected by the people that they represent. So a different way of understanding distributed collections would help us think about what that future work looks like. The other dimension I want to talk about is museums as public spaces. These are really big identity-forming moments relating to global heating, relating to truth-telling, and that's only in they're global issues, but for Australians, we've got some big stuff we need to work through. So how do we create and make spaces that can host that dialogue? How can we encourage that dialogue to be risky but also be supported? How can we, as representatives of institutions, how can we also go there as well and model that, take those risks and be prepared to make mistakes but learn from them as well, share those mistakes, and we always kind of think of, at the national conference when we talk about let's share the things that didn't work, it's like, okay, everyone kind of gets excited because we want to learn from each other's journeys. So that's me today, and I'm really sorry, but I am going to have to scoot at 9, but thank you for inviting me, and I hope the discussion is amazing.
2 years ago, Dawn Casey was the director, and she wrote in that collected book, and she wrote about the museum's main goals at that time, and they were pretty stock standard, I would say, particularly for a national museum, which was obviously to develop and maintain and exhibit a national historical collection, to do research into matters relating to Australian history. It really struck me how very broad and kind of almost meaningless some of these were, and to disseminate information relating to Australian history and to the museum and its functions. Okay, that was all good, and I would say that the staff at the time absolutely embraced all of those goals, and particularly I remember the focus on the collection was obviously huge when you're starting to build up a new national collection. But I think over those 21 years, the goals have definitely shifted and changed as public perceptions, not just nationally but internationally, of what the role of museums has changed. I think we've got a long way to go, as you rightly pointed out. We do have a long way to go. But I think we've taken some steps along the way. I think telling First Nations stories, there is a real commitment. I do believe there is a commitment at the museum to work in partnership, to co-curate, to consult, to be collaborative with communities. And I think they've done that, we have done that very successfully in some cases like Songlines, which is travelling internationally, with the Museums Encounters fellowship program, which brings Indigenous curators from around the country to experience things not just at the museum but elsewhere, other institutions. And the other area that we have really responded very strongly to is in relation to climate change and climate-related events. Obviously, we've got Great Southern Land, and I know Kirsten's going to talk more about that, so I won't really mention that, except to say it's a brand new, awesome permanent exhibition. You should all come and see it. But it does relate and engage very directly with really difficult topics of things that are affecting us all, literally as we speak, around Sydney. But the other area is in contemporary collecting, and I think I know museums around the world are doing that too, responding to COVID, and in our case to, what if we had fires, hail, you name it, and responding in real time. And I think there is an expectation from the people who come to see us, who come to see our collections and participate in our activities, that we will do that we are a safe space. We know that museums are very trusted globally, and that we have a role to play in helping people to understand not just what happened 1,500 years ago, but what is happening now. So we've done that particularly in relation to COVID and bushfires, as many of you know, through our Facebook pages and our Momentous website, which we see as a very dynamic web platform where people respond and can share in real time, and we'll continue to probably expand it to include other unfortunately national disasters. So look, I'm not going to really say much more than that, other than we've taken probably some baby steps and some bigger steps over the last 20 years. We have a long way to go. Jilda and I were talking about some of the ideas that came to us from the conference in WA, and looking at Boulevard, which is, we think, probably the newest of the large installed a new museum, but obviously newly refurbished, renovated, changed. And some of the challenges that poses to the rest of us and how we can engage in those. So maybe we can talk about that today or another forum. And that's it for me.
Tutorial team up until 2016, and then I said I really need a break, and I said I'm going to go off and do some other things, and I went and spent 6 years doing my own art practice, doing design, doing more design work, and also working as the director of a small Photo Access, a small community-focused photography centre. So the kind of opposite end of the museum and gallery scale, tiny team, tiny budgets. But I'm super pleased to be back at the museum as the very grandly named James O. Fairfax Senior Fellow for Environment and Culture, which feels like an enormous thing to step up to, particularly because there is no kind of program set for the fellowship. It's really an opportunity to, as I keep on hearing the words, amplify and extend the museum's engagement and role in national conversations about contemporary environmental change, which is pretty exciting. So I guess the perspective I wanted to bring to today's discussion is really about the more than human world, the non-human world. We all know we're living in a time of, unbelievable ecological crisis. I'm not going to detail it because it always makes me cry, to tell you the truth. And I'm so committed to the roles that museums and galleries and libraries and universities can play, the public humanities can play in evincing, kind of catalyzing the kind of cultural change that's required for us to do something about this situation. So I guess it was really interesting coming back to the National Museum, because I thought, why am I coming back to the National Museum? Why am I taking up this role? And it's really because I wanted again to be part of, I think, the National Museum's incredible contribution to this process about thinking about how collecting institutions can actually contribute to this kind of cultural change that we need. The museum, when it was kind of first, formalised in the 1970s, the theme of people in the environment was absolutely central to it. Indeed, it was arguably the theme of the museum, which changed over time. But in the intervening decades, the museum, I think, has done amazing work, as many places have, but I think the museum has had a particular kind of interest about how to embed concerns about people's relationships with the environment at the core of its processes. And that has always been it's been quite difficult along the way sometimes, because the museum has often defined itself, in the 90s as a social history museum, then as a cultural history museum, as a kind of multi-themed museum, and to bring the kind of way in which people are engaged and a part of more than human communities to the centre has sometimes been quite difficult. I remember lots of occasions sitting in collections meetings arguing that yes, we should acquire a taxidermy kangaroo because it's not a natural history object, it's a cultural history object. Those kinds of conversations went on for many years. So for me it's really wonderful to come back to the museum now, and particularly at the moment at which the big new permanent gallery, Great Southern Land, is opening. I can't speak with any authority about this gallery, but there are people in this room who can, and I particularly want to point to Gilda Andrews there, who was the producer, incredibly amazing creative producer, driving that project along really at the heart of it together with the curators. And love to you, Gilda, amazing accomplishment, and of course many other people at the museum. I think this is a really amazing exhibition, a really amazing step forward, because I think this gallery begins to do what I would call ecologising the museum, part of a much bigger project about decolonising the museum, but one that starts to centre at the heart of museum practice the concept, the understanding that people are only a tiny part of these much bigger, more than human communities that encompass things like wind and water and atmospheric changes, as well as platypus and fungi and all the kinds of moisture, the microbial, in our guts, all those kinds of things that actually mean that we're only one constituent of these amazing, complicated, changing communities, but that we have a particular role in them as well as people who are obviously, kind of capable of evincing incredible, catastrophic change upon them, which is also obviously change upon us. So
I think what's really wonderful about GSL, as it's called, Great Southern Land, which will become a kind of, you know, I can't say those words anymore, it's just GSL now. I mean, coming to this, I'm just so thrilled to see the way in which the museum has told a story about the continent, but very much a story about the continent in which people are connected, invited within the gallery space to feel themselves embodied as part of these communities. And it asks all these hard questions like, how can a museum communicate and help people to understand what it's like to be a platypus? What was it like to be a thylacine? What is it like to be, you know, a breath of wind? These are incredibly important and challenging questions for human beings generally, and I think the capacity for museums to do that because of the way we can be in spaces with other materialities is so powerful, and I think GSL makes amazing kind of steps towards that. And I think beyond even the kind of thinking about us within communities, it opens up in us a kind of a way, a possibility for thinking about what it might be to really take to heart the gift of the concept of country. Like, Australia is in such an amazing space that it has this unbelievable gift from First Australians that we can think about. There's already a kind of whole conceptual universe about a way that we can, in a respectful and located way, take that on board as something that can help us understand how we can actually be in this place and how we can be new kinds of people in Australia. And that's an incredible gift, and I think one that is really coming to the centre of museums, and that I think has to be almost the kind of idea at the centre of public humanities practice. I wrote this paper, I wrote there's lots of really interesting people kind of talking about this. I'm going to also just, using the terms, Fiona Cameron, in using the terms ecologising the museum, give a shout out to Fiona Cameron, wonderful museum scholar who uses this a lot. So I'm not going to talk very much more. I think I've kind of made clear where I think the kind of future of museums should be. I guess I wanted to, it's been really interesting for me coming to this now to think, well, what do I feel is the next steps? Great Southern Land is opening, and it's open now, it's soft opening, and will open, I think 15th of September is actually the date that we know now it's going to open to the public. I think, for me, I think there's two ways I want to kind of move forward with this. One is, I think, bringing my own kind of perspective. I really want to think more and work more around how a museum like the NMA, which is a kind of history museum, can engage with artists and with art practice. Because I think that they can bring a very particular kind of set of skills about dramatising, enlarging, revealing the emotional poetics of place and of people's relationships with place. And I think I'm really interested within that to think about how we can start to break the boundaries between collections and place. And that's to say, I'm interested in how we can think about maybe working with collection objects in ways that either take them back to spaces in which they have particular meaning, in which they can have incredible power in catalysing reactions, or indeed it might be collection-like objects. So it might be objects that get made from responding to the collection that can then go back to spaces to kind of help engage kind of people in place with what's going on there and kind of take action to address these huge ecological crises that we're facing. Thanks.
Yeah, it's sort of opening up the floor to you guys now to join the conversation. So if you've got a question or a comment or someone would like to share a story about something that you're doing in your roles, then yeah, it's open. Or the panel wants to comment to each other as well. KYLIE?
I was just going to say briefly that we focused the conversation today, or the panel today, on the ANU and the NMA, really just as a way to kind of draw some parameters. But we're very keen to hear from other experiences, other institutions, other places too. So, so this isn't just, ask the questions about the NMA or whatever, I mean, you can do that, but also we really like to hear about the work that you're all doing out in the communities and in your own kind of sectors and spaces, because one of the things that I know about kind of almost all of you is all the amazing work that you're all doing, and it's hard to make that visible in a context or in a single conversation like this. One of the challenges that we're having with this seminar, or not seminar series, this series is how to make all those voices louder, to use an overused word, to amplify those conversations, how to enable people who might not be so comfortable speaking publicly to do that, to find allies and colleagues, and you know, just to talk about the work that they're doing. Like, I'm so amazed and like so pleased that Louise is here, because Louise also is somebody who, you know, I've known for the whole time I've been involved in museum work and at ANU, and has made such a significant contribution again to the sector, but to the work that we do at the university. And I really do believe that the work we're doing is connected. So we're not a museum. I do have a hope that we will one day get a museum. Any rich philanthropists out there. But you know, it kind of doesn't matter. You know, our work is through these conversations and the public cultural programs that we're developing, and you know, we're always challenged by how do we do that more, how do we reach more people, how do we talk to more people. So we'd like to hear from you, and we've still got 2 more conversations in this series, and we'll probably focus the next one, I think, a bit more on those voices, so it'll be more like the last one and less like this one. But yeah, so I think that I am now talking too much. But Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise Hamby, and I've just been, you know, trying to soak up everything you've been saying, and it's hard being not in the field, because as an anthropologist, I haven't been to Arnhem Land now for like 3 years, and I feel like it's a different place now. And I think in terms of, if you like, dispersed collections, a few people have mentioned, you know, you've got a collection from Melangimbi. Well, IAXIS has got some, the NMA's got some, you know, everyone's got some. But my experience from working with people where these collections actually come from, people at Melangimbi, is what they really need in order to be part of this kind of conversation is they need to know, you know, what is this material and how did it get wherever it is. But frankly, they're not really concerned that it's the National Museum or the Macleay. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that it's theirs, and they would rather see how it comes together. You know, and in writing, you know, like I found, okay, this collection got split, and the Peabody Museum got this boomerang, and the NMA got the other one. But perhaps those 2 boomerangs belong together because they are a pair. I mean, there are pairs of boomerangs that you use together in Arnhem Land. So for people to know this, it needs people like all of you to do the work for them, and then they can become involved. Because you can't expect someone like JILDA to appear out of the woodwork just because you say, we need another Indigenous curator. You need to have people who know something about all of these wonderful collections to be involved. And maybe we also need to think about how they're involved. They don't need to have a PhD in anthropology to contribute to a conversation. We need to make space for people to participate in whatever level they can. And English is not going to be their first language in most cases, at least not with the people I work with. So you have to be able to work together, and not just one person. Maybe you need to have a linguist, an anthropologist, an art historian. You need all these people working together with someone, not just the curator at the NMA. Sorry to look, but you know what I mean. You need a team approach because people's needs are different. So that's just a little throwing out of ideas. Thanks.
MA and ANU, great collaboration and projects going on. One of the things I really want to think about is, when I listen to the presentation, is about the idea of museum as public space. So when we did a great job, when we really think about the idea of public, is how can we facilitate foreign not here, but actually in the museums. So how can we facilitate questions to get all the public, the visitors, within the museum to think about these ideas, for instance, back to the non-human ideas and back to the climate change, back to the indigenous futures. Canberra is a very homogenized area, place. Canberra is a very small area. So how can we have all these brilliant ideas to facilitate more meaningful, more capacity for lots of more people to engage? I think it's a good space for university and museum collaboration, because university can do is to attract more students in terms of future to get into the museum, to facilitate that kind of dialogue and conversation. So rather than just have that kind of work has been done here, but we can create more active learning for people to really engage with the objects and collections and the narration behind it. And then the facilitator, like you, can throw questions to the public and let them to think about it, rather than just passively standing there and try to understand what actually the genius idea from the creator's perspective. Otherwise, there's a huge gap between the creative work and the public work. So I think there is a space for collaboration in terms of how can university can facilitate the relationship between the public and the museum. That's just ideas.
Thank you. Collaborating with the museum around digital, kind of blue sky creative thinking about using the digital platforms, the digital world to work with the museum. And so we have students who are not necessarily museum studies or curatorial students, some of them are, but some of them are from computer science. And as I was about to say, many of them have never been to the museum when they start our course. And yeah, this has been a really interesting, it's been interesting for a lot of reasons, particularly seeing the creativity of the students and the ideas that they have, which are so sort of often free of the, as someone who's been involved with the lab sector for a long time, they often have ideas that I just never would have had. But it's also about bringing this interdisciplinary cohort of students to the museum and saying, like, the museum's not just there if you want to be a curator. It's like, this is, our collections are the public face of the humanities. It's like what most people don't engage with, you know, sorry Patty, but with a seminar series, or, you know, we get a bit of the public, that probably people who've already done degrees, but they go to museums. It's like, that's where they hear these stories, that's where they learn history, that's where they learn about culture. And so finding, and I think Yuji's so correct, it's like, find ways to bring our students. It's like, they're the people that we should engage with. So yeah, thank you.
There's a lot of themes that are mirrored in our gallery that are represented, you know, writ large over there because they've got the bucks to do it. But, you know, I think, and I completely agree with you about being able to work in this public, in a public way with philanthropists. But I don't think in Australia we do philanthropy. I mean, there are so many strings attached, I can't even tell you. But outside of Australia, and being able to learn from others outside of here that don't have these kind of, or that just have a different context and also have a different length of time of experience with trading the big cultural bucks, that we really need to be able to shape the philanthropic dimension and not just rely on or feel really guilty about black cladding, green cladding, all the other claddings that you can think of. But I think we need to be active in shaping that philanthropic environment.
Hi everyone, my name is Rowan Henderson and I'm here as a representative of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, which is the AMaGA we've been talking about today, ACT branch, and we're co-organisers of this wonderful event, Cultural Conversations with the Humanities Research Centre. And I think I'd just like to thank you all so much for the wonderful discussion that's come out of today, and this is a perfect example of, I think, our hopes for this session to bring together the practitioners who are working at the coalface with the people who in the museums have the ideas about our institutions, our glamour institutions. And as practitioners, we want to engage with those ideas and as the university, I think it's really interesting for you guys to hear about what we're doing as well, and hopefully this series will really bring that out. So thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you so much to our speakers. I just wanted to do a little advert for some of the AMaGA events that are coming up locally. So anyone in this room would be eligible to join AMaGA ACT as a member. It's about $140 a year. It's a bargain. You can claim it back on your tax. And we organise wonderful events, usually monthly. We've got the next event that's coming up is to visit the Australian Federal Police Museum out at Hume. That's at the end of this month on July 27th. After that, you can have a view inside the War Memorial large objects storage, sneak preview without going with the hordes of Canberrans that go on their open day. That's coming up in September, and in October we're continuing a series we've been doing recently, looking inside some of the smaller museums around Canberra that you may not have known about, and we'll be visiting the Australian National Museum of Education, which is at the University of Canberra. So sister organisation. So yes, please engage with AMaGA beyond these cultural conversations events.
So, well, I guess we'll close now, but thank you again. And I'm just conscious that there's still a little bit of food, and I at least am a bit hungry. So I don't know how long we're allowed to be here, but let's just eat quickly. So thank you, everybody.